The Battle of Mosul, fought between October 2016 and July 2017, was not merely a campaign to liberate a city. It was the culmination of years of political decay, sectarian tension, and regional conflict that allowed the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, to rise from the ashes of the Iraq War. The withdrawal of the United States forces from Iraq in 2011 left behind a fragile state, weakened by internal divisions and systemic corruption. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's government, dominated by Shiite political factions, pursued exclusionary policies that alienated Sunni Arab communities in northern and western Iraq. The disbanding of local militias, the marginalization of Sunni leaders, and the politicalization of the army created fertile ground for insurgency. ISIS, which had evolved from Al-Qaeda in Iraq under the leadership of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, exploited this discontent, and by 2013 the group had re-established its presence across Anbar, Nineveh, and Salahuddin provinces, while simultaneously expanding into Syria amid that country's own civil war. From its bases in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, ISIS launched a coordinated campaign to carve out a transitional caliphate, using propaganda and terror to project strength beyond its actual numbers. The Iraqi Security Forces, or ISF, were ill-prepared for this new threat. Despite receiving years of US training and billions in military aid, they remained plagued by inefficiency and corruption. Commanders often bought their positions, soldiers were poorly paid and frequently absent, and logistics were chaotic. So when ISIS forces advanced on Mosul in early June 2014, they encountered very little resistance. The fall of Mosul was both sudden and catastrophic. Approximately 1,500 ISIS fighters, using speed and psychological warfare, overwhelmed a garrison of over 30,000 Iraqi troops. Entire brigades collapsed, commanders fled, and the army's defences disintegrated within days. The militants seized vast quantities of American-made weaponry, including tanks, Humvees, and artillery, instantly transforming ISIS from a guerrilla force into a conventional army. On June 10, 2014, Mosul, once the second largest city in Iraq and a centre of trade, culture, and diversity, fell completely. Tens of thousands of residents fled across the Tigris River towards Kurdish-controlled areas, while those who remained were subjected to ISIS rule. The loss of Mosul was a national humiliation for Iraq. For many Iraqis, it symbolized the total collapse of the post-2003 order. For ISIS, it marked the birth of its self-declared caliphate. This is the story of the Battle of Mosul, Iraq's fiercest fight against ISIS. Welcome to Wars of the World. Following its capture of Mosul, ISIS declared the establishment of a caliphate on June 29, 2014, naming Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as its caliph. From the pulpit of the Al-Nuri Mosque, Baghdadi proclaimed a global Islamic state, calling on Muslims worldwide to pledge their allegiance. The significance of this act was profound. Mosul became the ideological and administrative heart of the Caliphate, serving as both its capital in Iraq and its most valued territorial possession. Under ISIS rule, Mosul underwent a dramatic transformation. The group imposed a rigid form of governance based on its extremist interpretation of Islamic law. The Diwan al-Hizbah, ISIS religious police, enforced strict social codes. Men were required to grow beards and attend prayers, while women were compelled to wear full niqabs, and public punishments, including amputations, crucifixions, and executions, were carried out in city squares. Economically, ISIS established a self-sustaining system of taxation and exploitation. They levied zakat, or religious taxes, on businesses, and confiscated property from non-Muslims and political dissidents. The looting of artifacts from Mosul's museum, and the destruction of ancient Assyrian heritage sites, such as Nimrud, drew global outrage, but also served as propaganda, reinforcing ISIS's rejection of secular history. The group's military administration turned Mosul into a fortress. Streets were barricaded, tunnels were dug beneath neighborhoods, and weapon caches were distributed throughout the city. Children were indoctrinated in ISIS schools and trained in their so-called Cubs of the Caliphate camps. The city's population, estimated at 1.5 million, became both a labor force and a human shield. By 2015, however, ISIS's grip began to weaken. The United States reformed an international coalition under Operation Inherent Resolve, providing support to Iraqi and Kurdish forces with air power and intelligence. Coalition airstrikes targeted ISIS convoys, oil infrastructure, and command centers, gradually diminishing the group's capacity to exert their control. As Iraqi forces recaptured Tikrit, Ramadi, and Fallujah between 2015 and mid-2016, Mosul became increasingly isolated. Although the Caliphate's borders contracted, its capital remained defiant, fortified, fanatical, and prepared for siege. By the summer of 2016, the Iraqi government began finalizing plans to retake Mosul. The campaign, codenamed Operation We Are Coming Nineveh, was designed to be the largest military operation in Iraq since the 2003 invasion. Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi faced immense political pressure to reclaim the city and to restore state authority. Victory in Mosul was not only a military objective, but a political necessity. The task itself, however, was formidable. Intelligence estimates placed between 5,000 and 7,000 ISIS fighters in Mosul, including foreign militants from Chechnya, Tunisia, and Western Europe. They possessed extensive tunnel systems, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, or VB-IEDs, and anti-tank weaponry. Every street, building, and bridge was prepared for urban warfare. The coalition assembled to confront this challenge included diverse and often competing factors. The Iraqi security forces formed the backbone of the assault, supported by the elite counter-terrorism services, or CTS, federal police units, and local Nineveh police. The Kurdish Peshmerga advanced from the north and the east, cutting supply lines towards Syria, and to the west, the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, a collection of mostly Shiite militias backed by Iran, secured rural areas and sought to prevent ISIS reinforcements or escape into Syria. The United States and its coalition partners played a decisive role. The Combined Joint Task Force, Operation Inherent Resolve, provided air support, artillery, and advisors embedded within Iraqi units. drones and satellite reconnaissance mapped the city's defenses, while precision airstrikes targeted ISIS leaders and infrastructure. By October 2016, coalition forces had conducted more than 12,000 strikes across Iraq, degrading ISIS's operational capabilities. Strategically, the plan called for a multi-pronged assault. Peshmerga forces would advance towards Mosul from the northeast, while Iraqi army units pushed from the south. The CTS would penetrate the eastern districts, crossing into the heart of the city once outer defences were breached. The campaign would rely heavily on encirclement, isolating ISIS's fighters while allowing civilians to escape through humanitarian corridors. Yet even the best-laid plans faced obstacles. Mosul's dense urban environment made air power difficult to employ without endangering civilians. ISIS's use of human shields and booby traps would slow progress to a crawl. And furthermore, the coalition's political cohesion was fragile. Tensions between Baghdad and Erbil, between Sunnis and Shiites, and between Iran and the United States threatened to complicate both command and control. But still, after months of preparation, the order to move in was given. At dawn on October 17, 2016, Prime Minister al-Abadi addressed the nation on television, announcing the start of the offensive. Quote, "The moment of victory has arrived. Today we declare the beginning of operations to liberate you, O people of Mosul." End quote. Within hours, artillery thundered across the Nineveh plains. Columns of Iraqi tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry advanced towards Mosul from multiple fronts, while coalition aircraft struck at ISIS positions using precision munitions. Kurdish Peshmerga forces moved swiftly through the northern villages, clearing routes towards the city and seizing the strategic town of Bashika. The early days of the offensive met moderate resistance. ISIS fighters withdrew into the city's core, avoiding open confrontation and instead relying on ambushes and suicide attacks. By late October, Iraqi forces had reached Mosul's eastern suburbs. The battle for the city itself had begun. Urban warfare in Mosul's east proved to be amongst the most intense of the conflict. The CTS led the assault through neighbourhoods like Gojali, Karama and Quds. Each advance required clearing the entire block of snipers, improvised explosive devices, and networks of tunnels. Coalition aircraft provided close air support, but progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, ISIS fighters deliberately positioning themselves in homes, mosques and schools, knowing that Iraqi and coalition forces were constrained by rules of engagement. Humanitarian corridors established by the United Nations quickly became overwhelmed as tens of thousands of residents attempted to flee the city. By January 2017, after 3 months of relentless combat, Iraqi forces had secured the eastern half of the city. It was a hard-fought victory that demonstrated both the resilience of the Iraqi troops and the determination of ISIS to fight to the last. Yet the western bank of the Tigris River still lay ahead, densely populated, heavily fortified, and poised to exact an even higher toll. The liberation of eastern Mosul in January 2017 was a decisive step, but it marked only the midpoint of a grueling campaign. The western side of the city, known as West Mosul, posed an even greater challenge. Unlike the wider boulevards and newer infrastructure of the east, the west was a labyrinth of narrow alleys, dense housing, and historical quarters, terrain that neutralized the Iraqi army's advantage in armor and mobility. Assessments of intelligence estimated that between 2,500 and 3,000 ISIS fighters remained entrenched in the west, many of them the group's most battle-hardened veterans. Among them were hundreds of foreign fighters who had vowed to die in Mosul rather than surrender. The western bank also contained the Old City, where landmarks such as the Al-Nuri Mosque and the Al-Habda minaret had become symbols of the Caliphate. Planning for the western assault took several weeks. Iraqi commanders, supported by US and coalition advisors, began to begin the new offensive in mid-February 2017. Engineers constructed temporary bridges across the Tigris to facilitate the movement of troops and supplies, while coalition aircraft intensified airstrikes on ISIS's defensive positions. On February 19, 2017, Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi formally announced the start of the battle for western Mosul. The operation opened with a coordinated push from the south and the west, spearheaded by the Federal Police and Rapid Response Division. Within days, they captured the Mosul airport, a strategic victory that provided a staging ground for further assaults. Nearby, the sprawling Ghazlani military base was also secured after intense fighting. Progress, however, was immediately met with fierce resistance. ISIS employed a sophisticated system of defenses. Streets were barricaded with burnt-out vehicles and rubble. Tunnels allowed fighters to appear unexpectedly behind advancing troops. Snipers and suicide bombers targeted any movement. As Iraqi forces pushed deeper, the fighting grew more chaotic and destructive. The Western offensive soon became synonymous with attrition. Every block had to be cleared individually. Soldiers frequently advanced without heavy armor, relying on infantry tactics and drone reconnaissance. Coalition air support was indispensable, but constrained by the proximity of civilians. The West Bank of Mosul was still home to nearly 500,000 people, most of whom were trapped inside their homes, too frightened to flee or unable to cross the front lines. The battle for western Mosul quickly evolved into one of the most intense urban combat situations since the Second World War. The Iraqi Counter-Terrorism Service took the lead once again, advancing through districts such as Al-Mamun, Al-Tayaran, and Al-Jadida, each advance being met with ambushes, sniper fire, and suicide attacks. ISIS deployed waves of vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, many of which were disguised as civilian cars or ambulances. The complexity of the battlefield was further complicated by the civilian population. ISIS deliberately used civilians as human shields, forcing families into homes near the front lines in order to deter airstrikes. Many residents were prevented from fleeing, and those who did attempt to escape faced the risk of execution. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations warned that western Mosul risked becoming a graveyard for civilians. By March 2017, the battle had entered its bloodiest phase. Airstrikes intensified as coalition forces sought to break ISIS resistance. Precision targeting proved challenging in the dense urban environment, leading to several catastrophic incidents that underscored the tragic human cost. On March 17, 2017, an airstrike in the Al-Jadida district triggered a massive explosion, reportedly setting off ISIS munitions hidden in a nearby building. More than 200 civilians were killed, marking one of the deadliest single incidents of the war. But despite the mounting casualties, Iraqi forces continued their advance. The federal police took control of the government complex and the area surrounding the Grand Mosque, while the CTS pushed northward towards the Old City. By late April, ISIS's territory had been reduced to a dwindling pocket along the Tigris River. The humanitarian toll was simply staggering. Hundreds of thousands of residents had fled the city, many seeking refuge in camps outside Mosul or in the Kurdistan region. Aid agencies struggled to cope with the influx of displaced persons. Those who were displaced described harrowing conditions, including starvation, constant bombardment, and the psychological terror of living under ISIS rule. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, estimated that more than 700,000 civilians were displaced during the Western Offensive alone. For those still trapped inside the city, life became a daily struggle for survival. Food was scarce, clean water was non-existent, and medical care was simply unavailable. Witnesses later recounted how ISIS executed anyone suspected of collaborating with Iraqi forces. Bodies lay uncollected in the streets as the fighting raged on overhead. By May 2017, ISIS's final stronghold was reduced to the old city of Mosul, a network of ancient alleys, mosques, and markets located on the western bank of the Tigris River. The Old City, significant for its historical and symbolic importance, became the site of ISIS's last stand in Iraq. The group's leadership ordered its fighters to defend the area, quote, to the last breath. The assault on the Old City began in late May, led by the Counter-Terrorism Service and supported by federal police units. The terrain posed unique challenges for mechanized warfare. The streets were too narrow for armored vehicles, requiring soldiers to advance on foot. Snipers fired from upper windows while ISIS fighters launched grenades from hidden tunnels. Communication and coordination were severely hampered by the maze-like environment. The human cost rose sharply. Many civilians, trapped in basements, found themselves caught in the crossfire. Airstrikes intended to strike at ISIS positions inadvertently destroyed residential buildings. The coalition's rules of engagement were repeatedly revised in order to reduce collateral damage, but the density of the combat zone left very little room for error. By mid-June, Iraqi forces were closing in on the symbolic heart of the Caliphate, the Al-Nuri Mosque. It was here, 3 years earlier, that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had declared the Caliphate. In a final act of defiance, ISIS detonated explosives within the mosque on June 21, 2017, destroying both the historic building and its iconic leaning minaret. Iraqi commanders described the demolition as, quote, the group's declaration of defeat, end quote. Fighting continued in the surrounding streets for weeks, each day bringing incremental progress at an immense cost. The United Nations later reported that in the last month of the battle alone, more than 10,000 civilians were killed or injured. The destruction of the Old City was nearly total. Aerial imagery showed entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. On June 9, 2017, after 9 months of relentless combat, Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi arrived in Mosul and declared victory. The following day, he announced the city's full liberation, proclaiming, quote, "the end and the failure of the false state of ISIS." End quote. This announcement marks the collapse of ISIS's territorial control in Iraq. What remained of the group's leadership had fled into the deserts of Anbar or crossed into Syria. However, the battle had left Mosul devastated. The cost of victory was measured not only in human lives, but also in the near-total destruction of one of Iraq's oldest cities. Estimates of the total death toll vary widely. The United Nations report more than 8,000 civilian deaths, while local officials estimate the number to be over 20,000. Military casualties were also significant, with the Iraqi counter-terrorism service, which led the most dangerous operations, losing nearly 40% of its personnel. The material damage was also equally severe. Satellite assessments conducted by UN Habitat in late 2017 reveal that approximately 40,000 buildings were destroyed or damaged, particularly in western Mosul. Bridges across the Tigris River were demolished, the electrical grid was devastated, and water systems were contaminated. Hospitals, schools, and markets lay in ruins. The humanitarian aftermath was undoubtedly overwhelming. Nearly 1 million people had been displaced during the campaign, many of whom had no homes left to return to. Refugee camps around Mosul and Erbil became semi-permanent settlements. Diseases spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions, and resources for reconstruction were scarce. For months after the battle, bodies continued to be recovered from the rubble. The stench of decomposition filled the air in parts of the old city. Demining operations began almost immediately, as thousands of unexploded ordnance and booby traps posed lethal threats to returning residents. Reconstruction agencies described Mosul as, quote, "one of the most contaminated urban environments on Earth." End quote. Liberation did not bring immediate stability to Mosul. In the months following the declaration of victory, the city faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding amidst political fragmentation and economic strain. The central government in Baghdad struggled to coordinate recovery efforts among competing local entities, including tribal groups, Kurdish authorities, and Shiite militias. To address these challenges, the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, launched the Funding Facility for Stabilization, an initiative aimed at restoring essential services such as electricity, water, and healthcare. And by 2020, the program had supported the rehabilitation of thousands of homes, over 60 schools, and multiple hospitals. However, full reconstruction was projected to take decades. Reconciliation also proved to be a significant challenge. Many residents accused returning security forces and militias of sectarian biases and abuse during the campaign. Former ISIS collaborators, or those merely suspected of sympathy towards the group, were often detained or ostracized. The diverse social fabric of Mosul, once home to Arabs, Kurds, Turkmen, and Christians, had been severely damaged. International donors pledged billions in aid at conferences in Kuwait and elsewhere. However, bureaucratic delays and corruption has hindered progress. By 2019, much of western Mosul remained in ruins, with thousands of families still living in temporary shelters with limited employment opportunities. But despite these challenges, signs of recovery has slowly emerged. The University of Mosul has been reopened, offering classes in partially restored buildings. The reconstruction of the Al-Nuri Mosque began under UNESCO's Revive the Spirit of Mosul initiative, funded by the United Arab Emirates. Civil society groups, artists, and volunteers initiated projects to restore the city's cultural identity and to heal the psychological wounds. However, security has remained fragile. Although ISIS had lost its territorial base, remnants of the group persisted in rural areas, conducting sporadic attacks. The battle for Mosul had destroyed the Caliphate, but it had not eradicated the underlying conditions that had given rise to it: sectarian division, economic disparity, and ultimately weak governance. Years after its liberation, Mosul remains a landscape marked by memory and loss. The scars of battle are evident not only in its shattered infrastructure, but also in the collective psyche of its people. Survivors recount tales of endurance, betrayal, and unimaginable suffering. Demographically, the city has changed significantly. Many minority communities, including Christians and Yazidis, have not returned, altering Mosul's once diverse character. Economic recovery has also been uneven, and unemployment remains high. But nevertheless, local initiatives have begun to rebuild civic life. Youth groups organize cultural festivals, artists paint murals over the ruins, and former soldiers participate in reconciliation programs. While international attention has waned, Mosul endures as a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. For Iraq, the city's liberation reaffirmed national sovereignty. For the global coalition, it marked the culmination of a costly but necessary campaign. For historians and strategists, it serves as a case study in modern warfare, where politics, religion, technology, and human suffering converge. The Battle of Mosul reshaped Iraq's modern identity. It was the fiercest fight in the country's recent history, waged not just for territory, but for the future of the Iraqi state. In its aftermath, Mosul stands as a reminder that victory in war is merely the beginning of peace, and that the true struggle lies in the reconstruction of cities, nations, and trust among their people. The casualties reflect the intensity of the conflict, with approximately 1,200 ISF personnel being killed and over 8,000 wounded, while estimates of ISIS combatant deaths range from 6,000 to 9,000. Civilian losses were significantly higher than initially reported, largely due to the brutal nature of the fighting. The Battle of Mosul occupies a central place in the history of modern warfare. Militarily, it represented one of the largest and most complex urban operations since the Second World War, involving an estimated 100,000 Allied personnel and lasting around 9 months. The campaign combined conventional tactics, counterinsurgency, and counter-terrorism within a single theatre of operations. Analysts have identified several key lessons. The first concerns the nature of modern urban warfare. The Mosul campaign demonstrated that victory in dense urban terrain requires small unit cohesion, real-time intelligence, and close coordination between air and ground assets. The Iraqi counter-terrorism services experience underscored the importance of specialized training for urban combat. Second, the battle revealed the limitations of precision air power in populated environments. Despite technological advances, minimizing civilian casualties proved extraordinarily difficult. The humanitarian cost of the campaign reignited debates about proportionality and ethics in contemporary warfare. Third, Mosul illustrated the interplay between military victory and political stability. The liberation of territory did not automatically produce governance or reconciliation. The post-battle phase required as much strategic attention as the combat itself, a lesson that continues to inform doctrine for counter-insurgency. Historically, Mosul has marked the symbolic and practical end of ISIS's caliphate. Within months of its fall, Raqqa in Syria also collapsed, reducing ISIS to a dispersed insurgency. Yet the group's ideological influence persisted, inspiring affiliates from the Sahel to Southeast Asia. The fight for Mosul thus stands as both a victory over a territorial threat and a cautionary tale about the enduring power of extremist ideology. Eight years after its liberation, Mosul is both rebuilt and marked by its past. Markets have reopened, the sounds of reconstruction fill the air, and children are once again attending school amid the remnants of their neighborhoods. The city is showing signs of renewed life, though much work still remains. Efforts are underway to rebuild its historic old city, with international organizations like UNESCO focusing on cultural heritage, education, and strengthening community spirit. Reconstruction initiatives include the restoration of significant religious sites, such as the Al-Habda minaret in the Great Mosque of Al-Nuri and other various churches. However, the memory of the battle endures as a cautionary tale about governance, ideology, and resilience. Strategically, the campaign marked a definitive military defeat for ISIS's territorial ambitions. Politically, it revealed the fragility of states emerging from prolonged intervention and civil strife. Sociologically, it highlighted the remarkable capacity of ordinary citizens to survive, adapt, and rebuild. For historians, the Battle of Mosul will be remembered alongside the likes of Stalingrad, Hue, and Grozny in the study of urban warfare, events in which the city itself became both a prize and participant. For Iraq, it represents the fiercest struggle of a generation, fought not only for land, but for the reclamation of national identity from chaos. When the minaret of the Al-Nuri Mosque rises again over the western bank of the Tigris, it will symbolize more than just reconstruction. It will represent the resilience of a people who endured the collapse of civilization and refused to vanish beneath its ruins. The Battle of Mosul closed one of the darkest chapters in Iraq's modern history, but also opened another, the long and difficult endeavor of rebuilding a pluralistic, stable, and self-reliant state.